On the frozen dawn of December 16, 1944, the quiet of the Ardennes forest shattered beneath the roar of thousands of German guns. The barrage stretched from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, over 80 miles of front, as Hitler's last gamble in the west began. To the Allied soldiers billeted in the small Belgian and Luxembourg villages, it was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place to rest and refit. Instead, it became the crucible of the Battle of the Bulge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Adolf Hitler called the operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a name chosen to deceive Allied intelligence. His plan was as audacious as it was desperate, to strike through the Ardennes, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. A successful offensive, he believed, might force Britain and America into a negotiated peace, buying Germany time to finish new wonder weapons and redirect forces to the collapsing Eastern Front. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and luck. The 5th Panzer Army under General Otto von Manschenfeld would spearhead the assault through the center, the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich would drive north toward the Meuse, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger would protect the southern flank. Between them lay the road network that converged at one crucial hub, Bastogne. Bastogne, a market town of 4,000 in southern Belgium, seemed insignificant on any map until one looked closer. 7 roads radiated from it like the spokes of a wheel, each vital for moving men and armor through the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the German advance. The initial German onslaught caught the Allies completely off guard. Thick fog grounded Allied aircraft. Forward units, particularly elements of the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, were overrun in the opening hours. Columns of Tiger and Panther tanks, supported by the Fallschirmjäger and Volksgrenadiers, punched holes through the American lines. Refugees flooded westward as U.S. convoys jammed the snow-covered roads. By December 18, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, finally grasped the scale of the attack. General Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting in Verdun. When his staff recommended retreating to the Meuse, Eisenhower shook his head. The enemy must be stopped where he is. We'll hold the shoulders and counterattack. Orders rippled outward. To General George S. Patton, commanding the 3rd Army in Lorraine, came a nearly impossible task: pivot his entire army north to relieve Bastogne. To the 101st Airborne Division, resting at Montmelon, France, came a shorter, simpler message from the 1st Army: move immediately to Bastogne and hold it at all costs. The men of the 101st had fought in Normandy and Holland. They were combat-hardened but exhausted. Their commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington, leaving Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery chief, as acting commander. Trucks rumbled through the night, loaded with paratroopers shivering under blankets and overcoats. Many had no winter gear, some lacked ammunition and even boots. They passed retreating units moving the opposite way, soldiers shouting warnings: "You're going the wrong way, the Krauts are coming." When McAuliffe's lead elements rolled into Bastogne on December 19, they found chaos: stragglers from shattered divisions, terrified civilians, and scattered armor units of the 10th Armored Division already preparing to make a stand. Snow fell steadily. The roads froze hard as iron. Somewhere beyond the fog and forest, German panzers were closing in. The paratroopers dug in along the ridgelines east and north of the town. In the candlelit cellars, townspeople whispered prayers. And at the division command post, McAuliffe studied his maps by lantern light, knowing that within days, Bastogne would be encircled, and history would test the 101st Airborne's courage like never before. The siege had not yet begun, but the trap was already closing. In the morning gloom of December 19, 1944, the mood inside the headquarters at Verdun was electric with disbelief. The situation maps glowed red with enemy markers pushing westward. The German thrust, once dismissed as a minor spoiling attack, had erupted into a full-blown offensive. The Ardennes, a region Allied intelligence had considered too rugged for major operations, was now alive with enemy armor. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, listened as his staff read field reports from the front. Brigadier General Kenneth Strong, his G2 intelligence chief, outlined the scale of the crisis. "It's no local counterattack," Strong warned. "It's a major offensive, at least 3 armies." Eisenhower's pipe hung motionless from his mouth as he absorbed the news. Then he looked up and spoke calmly. "We can't afford to pull back. The enemy must be stopped on this line. Hold on the north and south flanks, and hit back in the center." That same day, in Luxembourg, General Omar Bradley met with his corps commanders. His map table showed enemy arrows stabbing deep toward the Meuse River. The names Bastogne and St. Vith stood out, critical junctions whose loss would open the roads to Antwerp. Bradley ordered reinforcements rushed to both. To Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division would go by truck convoy, to St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division. "The paratroopers are the only reserve close enough," Bradley remarked. "Get them there before the Krauts do." Meanwhile, 100 miles to the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army was hammering through Lorraine. When he received Eisenhower's call, he was already en route to a command conference. He arrived in Verdun that afternoon, snow still clinging to his trench coat. Eisenhower briefed him on the situation and asked, "How soon can you turn your army north?" Patton didn't hesitate. 3 days, he replied. Around the table, officers exchanged incredulous glances. Patton explained that his staff had already drawn contingency plans, Operations Lucky Strike, Cold Feet, and Bridgehead, for exactly such a pivot. His corps would wheel 90 degrees north, cross the Moselle, and strike at Bastogne. Eisenhower, impressed, simply nodded. "Do it," he said. "Relieve Bastogne." By nightfall, the roads of eastern France were jammed with Patton's columns grinding northward through snow and ice. The 4th Armored Division led the way, followed by infantry and artillery in endless convoys of jeeps, half-tracks, and Sherman tanks. To the men, it felt like turning a mountain on wheels. Far to the northwest, the 101st Airborne was already moving toward the storm. Truckloads of paratroopers from the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry regiments bounced along frozen roads, rifles between their knees. Some dozed, others sang to drown the fear. Many still wore the thin jump uniforms from Holland. The bitter cold cut through everything. Major General Maxwell Taylor was still in Washington, so command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a mild-mannered artilleryman known for his calm humor. At every stop, McAuliffe checked on his men, making sure the convoys kept rolling. "Hold Bastogne," the orders said. No one knew yet that within days, they would be completely surrounded. By December 20th, the German spearheads had reached the outskirts of the town. Columns from Manschaufel's 5th Panzer Army and Luttwitz's XLVII Panzer Corps were closing from the north, east, and south. The fog remained thick, grounding Allied air cover. Roads clogged with retreating units, cooks, clerks, and engineers, who had thrown away their rifles. But amid the chaos, the paratroopers arrived, forming a human wall around Bastogne's vital crossroads. At SHAF headquarters, Eisenhower's staff watched the developing pocket on their maps, a small circle of blue surrounded by red. Bastogne was the hinge of the German drive, and its defense would decide whether Hitler's gamble succeeded or failed. That night, as the snow fell heavier, Patton's divisions pushed north through the darkness. In Bastogne, McAuliffe and his staff prepared for siege. The radio crackled with fragmented messages, then silence. The ring was closing, and soon the 101st Airborne would stand alone. The orders from SHAF were clear: hold Bastogne. No withdrawal. By dawn on December 20th, 1944, Bastogne was surrounded in everything but name. Snow swirled through the narrow streets as Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe stood over a map lit by a single lantern in the cellar of the Heinz Barracks. His officers huddled close: Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry, Colonel Robert Sink of the 506th Parachute Infantry, and Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division's young operations officer. Reports came in by field phone, the lines crackling with static. German armor was closing in from all directions. The XLVII Panzer Corps, commanded by General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, had seized the roads north and south. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and 26th Volksgrenadier Division were pressing in hard. Bastogne was now a pocket, 7 roads leading in, all in enemy hands. The 101st Airborne and remnants of the 10th Armored Division were alone, cut off, outnumbered nearly 5-1. McAuliffe refused to panic. "We'll hold," he said simply, tapping his pipe against the map table. "We've been through worse." Around him, his staff nodded. They had jumped into Normandy and Holland, they knew how to fight surrounded. Still, the weather was their worst enemy. Temperatures plunged below zero. Supply trucks could no longer reach them. Ammunition was rationed. Food was running low. The men melted snow for water and slept in frozen foxholes. The civilian population of Bastogne, some 3,000 souls who had refused to flee, took shelter in basements and church crypts. One of them was René Lemaire, a young Belgian nurse who volunteered to help the U.S. medics. Working beside Major Jack Pryor of the 326th Medical Company, she cared for the wounded in a makeshift hospital inside the presbytery. "She was our angel," one paratrooper later wrote. "She never left the wounded, no matter the shelling." The Germans probed the perimeter daily, testing for weakness. To the north, near Noville, tanks from Kampfgruppe clashed with paratroopers of the 506th PIR under Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade and Easy Company's Captain Dick Winters. The Americans held at terrible cost, burning tanks with bazookas and 57mm guns at point-blank range. To the southeast, at Marvy, glider infantry of the 327th repelled repeated assaults by Volksgrenadiers. Every hamlet around Bastogne became a name etched in blood: Foy, Bizery, Longvilly, Assinois. By December 21, the siege was complete. McAuliffe's radio operators could still receive faint signals from 8 Corps, but transmission was nearly impossible. Patton's Third Army was advancing north, but no one in Bastogne knew how close he truly was. The paratroopers' only certainty was that they were on their own. Despite the hardships, morale held. In the command post, Kinnard encouraged officers to circulate among their men, keeping spirits high. Chaplains held open-air services in the snow. Soldiers shared chocolate, cigarettes, and black humor. One sign outside a dugout read, "Welcome to Bastogne, visitors stay limited to 1 round trip." German artillery rained down relentlessly. The town's churches, warehouses, and homes were reduced to rubble. On the 24th, a shell hit the aid station where René Lemaire worked, igniting a fuel dump. She was killed while trying to save her patients, one of the many civilians who perished during the siege. Christmas approached, bitter and silent. Snowflakes drifted through shattered windows. In the freezing darkness, American soldiers listened to the distant rumble of tanks and the muffled hymns of townspeople praying in cellars. Inside the command post, McAuliffe drafted his Christmas message to the troops. "What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting. It's cold, we're short of food and ammunition, but we're holding. We're giving the Germans more than they're sending at us. Keep up the spirit. Merry Christmas." His men smiled when they read it. Even surrounded, the 101st Airborne would not yield. The ring was closing tighter now, and the Germans were preparing an ultimatum. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the morning of December 22, 1944, Bastogne lay under a heavy gray sky, silent except for the dull thud of distant shellfire. Snow covered the wreckage of trucks and collapsed buildings, softening the scars of battle. Inside the cellar of the Heinz barracks, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his staff were eating a cold breakfast of tinned meat when the sentries outside reported an unusual sight: 2 German officers approaching under a white flag. They were escorted through the lines by Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore of the 327th Glider Infantry. One of them, Major Wagner, carried a neatly folded letter, stamped with the insignia of the XLVII Panzer Corps. He bowed stiffly, handed it over, and said in accented English, from the German commander, General von Luttwitz. The letter was addressed to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. It read, "The fortune of war is changing. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation, that is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2-hour term." The room fell silent as McAuliffe read it aloud. He set the paper down, looked around at his officers, and muttered, "Ah, nuts." The men burst into laughter. Colonel Harry Kinnard, grinning, said, "That's perfect, Tony, that's exactly what we should tell them." McAuliffe chuckled, then nodded. "All right, write it up." A typewriter clattered in the corner as the reply took shape. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. When the German emissaries were brought back for the answer, they appeared confused by the single word. Major Wagner asked politely, "What does this mean, nuts?" Colonel Harper, who handed him the note, smiled. "It means," he explained, "go to hell." The Germans stiffened, saluted curtly, and were escorted back through the snow to their lines. Within the hour, the message was relayed to General Luttwitz's headquarters. There was disbelief, then anger, but also, among some of his officers, a grudging respect. Few expected an encircled enemy to reject surrender with such audacity. Word of McAuliffe's reply spread through Bastogne like wildfire. Men shouted it across the trenches. "Nuts" became both a battle cry and a joke, a symbol of defiance in the frozen dark. Soldiers scrawled it on walls, trucks, and even artillery shells. That afternoon, the German bombardment began. The snow-muted thunder of artillery rolled over the town for hours, shaking the ground. Church bells toppled. Buildings that had stood since the 1800s collapsed in flames. Yet when the shelling stopped and infantry began probing the American lines, they met the same resistance as before, stubborn, precise, and deadly. At Marvy, glider infantrymen repelled waves of Volksgrenadiers supported by tanks. South of town, bazooka teams ambushed panzers from point-blank range, knocking them out in flashes of fire that lit the night. Each road into Bastogne was defended by a handful of men fighting as if the entire war depended on their position, and in many ways, it did. Inside the town, McAuliffe wrote his situation report to 8 Corps, "We are giving the Germans more than we're taking. Still holding. Morale excellent." By evening, the men of the 101st celebrated their nuts reply with laughter and coffee brewed from melted snow. Outside, the temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero, and the crack of rifles echoed across the white fields. In the following days, the Germans would redouble their efforts to crush Bastogne. But for the Americans, that one word, nuts, had become more than a reply. It was a declaration that they would never surrender, no matter the odds. And as the snow fell thicker that night, it seemed even the frozen Ardennes whispered the same defiance back to the enemy, nuts. December 23, 1944. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold was sharper than ever, the kind that froze rifles solid and turned breath into clouds of glass. The men of the 101st Airborne Division and their attached units were running on exhaustion and adrenaline. They had endured 5 days of siege, 5 days of constant shelling, and 5 nights of freezing winds cutting through their thin uniforms. Yet still, they held. At dawn, German artillery thundered again. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, backed by tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division, launched a coordinated assault from the northeast. Waves of infantry moved through the snow, firing from the hip, their dark shapes barely visible against the whitened landscape. On the American line near Foy, paratroopers of the 502nd PIR crouched in foxholes, waiting for the right range. When the 1st Panther tank appeared through the fog, Sergeant Gene Overton of Fox Company shouldered a bazooka and fired. The rocket struck the turret squarely, a flash of orange in the gray morning. "They just kept coming," one soldier recalled later. "It was like shooting ghosts." Throughout the day, the the Germans attacked along every road leading into Bastogne, at Marvy, Luzery, Assenois, and Warden. Each assault met the same grim reception. At Marvy, the 327th Glider Infantry fought off a reinforced regiment, using captured German MG-42s when their own machine guns overheated. Tanks from Team O'Hara of the 10th Armored Division provided what little armor support the defenders could muster, their Shermans darting between buildings to ambush panzers at close range. Every block, every hedgerow, became a battleground. American artillery, firing from inside Bastogne, rained steel on the advancing Germans. Battery C of the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion fired until their gun barrels glowed red, rationing shells as the supply dwindled. Ammunition was down to a handful of rounds per man. Medics worked in cellars, operating without anesthesia, their hands numb with cold and blood. Yet despite everything, hunger, frostbite, and fatigue, morale remained fierce. Then, in the afternoon, a miracle broke through the gray sky. For the first time in a week, the weather cleared. The low clouds parted, and the steady drone of engines filled the air. Men looked up from their foxholes to see the silver bellies of C-47 Skitrans of the 9-Troop Carrier Command flying low over the snow. Parachutes blossomed above Bastogne, red, yellow, green, bringing life. Crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies thudded into the snow. Paratroopers cheered and waved their helmets. "The Angels are back," someone shouted. An hour later, the deep rumble of P-47 Thunderbolts echoed overhead. American fighters from the 362nd Fighter Group swept in, strafing German convoys and blasting artillery positions. To the men trapped in Bastogne, it was the sound of hope. "We knew then we weren't forgotten," one corporal later said. That night, under flickering lanterns in the Heinz barracks, McAuliffe and his staff studied their maps. Reports from patrols suggested the Germans were regrouping for another major push. But the supply drops had renewed the division's strength. McAuliffe, tired but smiling, told his officers, "We'll stay right here. The 101st doesn't retreat." The cold deepened after sundown. The horizon flashed red where artillery shells struck, lighting the snow like lightning. Inside foxholes, soldiers huddled together for warmth, sharing coffee and stories from home. Someone passed around a newspaper clipping about the Nuts' reply. Laughter rippled through the trenches. It was absurd, maybe even reckless, but it was their story now. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne was still holding. The men decorated small pine branches with bits of tin foil from ration packs. Chaplains held a midnight service in a ruined chapel, their voices soft against the distant thunder of guns. "Peace on earth," the chaplain read, "goodwill toward men." Outside, another German barrage began, but the paratroopers didn't flinch. For every shell that fell, they answered with defiance. Bastogne would not fall. The line would hold, because it had to. Somewhere to the south, Patton's tanks were still fighting their way north. The men didn't know when he'd arrive, only that he was coming. And so, through the coldest night of the year, the 101st Airborne dug in deeper, rifles ready, waiting for the dawn. South of Bastogne, through blizzards and wrecked villages, the rumble of engines and treads grew louder each day. It was the sound of Patton's Third Army, fighting its way north through ice, mud, and resistance to reach the trapped 101st Airborne. George S. Patton had promised Eisenhower he would relieve Bastogne in 3 days. Every man under his command knew it, and every one of them was determined to make it true. The task fell primarily to Major General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division, spearheaded by Colonel Creighton Abrams' Combat Command B. Their orders were simple but brutal: break through to Bastogne, no matter what it costs. From the town of Ardennes, they advanced north, fighting mile by mile against the 5th Parachute Division and elements of Panzerlehr, who had dug in along the ridges south of Bastogne. On December 23, the same day the skies cleared over Bastogne, Patton's columns began their attack. Snowdrifts hid mines, trees felled by retreating Germans blocked the roads. The men worked through the night to clear them, freezing fingers on steel tools. When tanks bogged down, infantrymen helped dig them out. Every hour mattered. Patton's diary entry that night was brief but telling: Bastogne must be reached. The 101st is still holding. Fighting intensified near Martelange and Bougainville, where Sherman tanks clashed with Panthers at ranges so close the gunners could see each other's breath. The Americans advanced behind sheets of artillery fire, leapfrogging forward under cover of smoke. Creighton Abrams' men moved fast and fought faster. His battalion commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, 37th Tank Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel George Jacques, 53rd Armored Infantry, coordinated a relentless push toward Ardennes, the last village south of Bastogne. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, McAuliffe's men endured their hardest days. The Germans had tightened the ring and were pressing from all sides. Ammunition remained scarce despite airdrops, and many soldiers now wore rags around their boots to fight frostbite. Still, the defenders refused to yield. "If we're going to be rescued," one paratrooper said, "we better make sure there's something left to rescue." By Christmas morning, Patton's forward units had reached Chaumont, just 4 miles from Bastogne, but the Germans held firm. The 11th Armored Division, on Patton's right, was stalled by counterattacks and icy roads. Patton, furious at the delay, drove north personally to the front, shouting to a colonel, "Move your tanks. I don't care if you have to drag them." His commanders understood, this wasn't a tactical mission anymore, it was a promise. On December 26, at 4:50 p.m., tanks from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, led by Sergeant Osborne and Corporal Frank Chip Pip, crept into the southern edge of Ardennes. Smoke and snow choked the air. German 88s fired from the woods ahead, but the Shermans kept advancing. At 4:55, Pip's tank broke through the last roadblock and rolled past startled American outposts. A paratrooper waved them down. "You guys from Patton?" he shouted. "Hell yes," Pip replied. "Merry Christmas." The siege of Bastogne had been broken. McAuliffe's headquarters received the message minutes later, contact established with elements of 4th Armored Division. Cheers erupted across the town. Men who hadn't smiled in days were laughing, shaking hands, some crying openly. Patton's army had done it in exactly 3 days. When the general heard the report, he smiled thinly and said, "Well, this is a hell of a Christmas present." Then, turning to his staff, he added, "Tell McAuliffe he's the best damn soldier in the field today." The relief didn't end the fighting, not yet. The road into Bastogne was narrow and still under fire, and the 101st was far from safe. But the back of the siege had been broken, and the legend of Bastogne was sealed. Snow continued to fall over the town that night, covering the wreckage and the dead alike. But for the first time in days, the men of the 101st Airborne slept without fear of annihilation. The sound of tank engines outside their lines was the sound of life. The link-up between Patton's 4th Armored Division and the besieged 101st Airborne on December 26, 1944, marked a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. Yet the fight for Bastogne was far from over. Relief had come, but the Germans had no intention of surrendering the crossroads town that anchored their offensive. For the next several days, both sides fought savagely to secure or retake ground around Bastogne's perimeter. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of XLVII Panzer Corps, still believed he could crush the Americans before Patton's reinforcements fully consolidated. On December 27, his armor, remnants of Panzerlehr and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, struck at Marvy, Warden, and Ardennes in desperate counterattacks. The defenders, though weary and half-frozen, held firm. From the shattered buildings of Bastogne's outskirts, men of the 502nd and 327th Glider Infantry fired at muzzle flashes through the snow. Tank destroyers from the 705th TD Battalion, hidden behind piles of rubble, ambushed German armor as it tried to edge down narrow roads. The P-47 Thunderbolts of the 366th Fighter Group, now operating freely under clear skies, roared overhead, dropping bombs and strafing retreating columns. Patton's relief force pushed hard to widen the corridor south of Bastogne. Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion advanced toward Madrid, blasting through strongpoints with high-velocity fire. Meanwhile, the 101st Airborne, no longer surrounded, went on the offensive for the first time since the siege began. McAuliffe ordered local counterattacks to retake high ground and clear the approaches. The paratroopers, though exhausted, relished the change. "Now it's our turn," one sergeant of the 506th PIR remarked. Still, conditions remained brutal. The weather, which had cleared briefly, closed in again. Snowstorms returned, turning roads into ice-slick death traps. Medical units worked around the clock. Wounded men were finally being evacuated in jeeps and ambulances, but frostbite casualties still mounted. 1/4 of the 101st strength had been reduced by injury, hunger, or exposure. Yet morale soared. The knowledge that they had held out against overwhelming odds, and that the world now knew it, gave them strength. On December 28, Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters declared Bastogne secure. The headlines in Stars and Stripes in the Associated Press carried the story across the world: "Bastogne relieved, paratroopers hold firm, Patton keeps his promise." President Roosevelt himself would later remark that Bastogne would forever stand as an example of American courage. Hitler, furious at the stalled offensive, demanded his generals retake Bastogne at any cost. But the German army no longer had the strength. The 2nd Panzer Division, shattered east of Dinant, was in retreat. The 116th Panzer and Panzerlehr were battered beyond repair. Ammunition was scarce, fuel almost gone. What had begun as a bold winter thrust was now a bloody withdrawal. By January 1, 1945, the German High Command began pulling back across the Ardennes. The initiative in the west had shifted decisively to the Allies. Patton pressed north toward Houffalize to meet up with the First Army, closing the Bulge from the south. Bastogne, once the center of encirclement, was now the spearhead of the counterattack. When the final shells stopped falling, the devastation was immense. The town of Bastogne was a ruin of smoldering timbers and collapsed stone. Civilians emerged from cellars after weeks underground. American engineers began clearing mines and repairing roads, while supply convoys rolled in bringing food, ammunition, and medical aid. In his field journal, McAuliffe wrote, "The men of this division have written a new page in history. Bastogne will never be forgotten." He was right. Within days, journalists and photographers flooded the area, documenting the battlefield and the men who had defied the odds. The 101st Airborne was soon pulled off the line for rest and refit, though many refused to see themselves as heroes. "We just did our job," one private said quietly as he boarded a truck heading west. But the world saw it differently. Bastogne became more than a battle, it was a symbol of resolve, of defiance in the face of impossible odds. And at its heart was a single word that summed up the spirit of that frozen Christmas: nuts. When the smoke cleared over the Ardennes in January 1945, Bastogne stood as both ruin and revelation. What had once been a quiet Belgian crossroads was now immortalized in the annals of military history, a symbol of courage, endurance, and unyielding spirit in the face of encirclement. The 101st Airborne Division, battered and frostbitten, had done what few thought possible: held the line against a full German panzer assault during the deadliest winter of the war. The victory at Bastogne was more than tactical, it was psychological. Hitler's grand gamble, the Ardennes offensive, had sought to fracture the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and divide British and American forces. But Bastogne shattered that illusion. The stubborn defense delayed the German timetable long enough for Allied air power and reinforcements to turn the tide. It became the pivot point upon which the entire Battle of the Bulge collapsed. General Eisenhower would later call Bastogne the hinge of fate. Indeed, when Patton's Third Army linked up with McAuliffe's defenders on December 26, 1944, it was more than the relief of a garrison, it was the moment Germany's last offensive in the West began to crumble. Within weeks, the Bulge was erased from Allied maps, and the Wehrmacht's retreat to the Rhine began. In the months that followed, the 101st Airborne pushed east again, into Alsace, across the Rhine, and deep into Bavaria, until the guns finally fell silent in May 1945. Yet for most who fought there, Bastogne remained the memory that defined their war. Sergeant Joe Toy of Easy Company later recalled, "I was never as cold, never as scared, and never as proud." For the Germans, Bastogne became a bitter reminder of the campaign's failure. Captured officers later told Allied interrogators that they had underestimated both the tenacity of the paratroopers and the speed of Patton's counterattack. One officer from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division admitted, "We thought they would surrender. Instead, they fought like wolves in a trap." In post-war years, historians and veterans alike returned to Bastogne. The ruins were rebuilt, the fields clear of wreckage and bones. The people of Belgium, who had endured bombardment and occupation, never forgot their American liberators. On the outskirts of the town, a great Martyson memorial was raised in 1950, its massive stone walls engraved with the names of all 50 U.S. states in a single inscription in Latin. The Belgian people remember their American liberators. General McAuliffe, the man who had answered the German surrender demand with one immortal word, nuts, would return to Bastogne years later. Standing before a crowd of veterans and villagers, he smiled as he read the inscription. "This monument," he said, "does not glorify war, it glorifies the human spirit when it refuses to yield." Patton, too, recognized what Bastogne represented. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The 101st Airborne held fast when everything around them was breaking. Their stand gave us time, gave us hope, and gave the enemy hell." Bastogne became legend, studied in military academies for its lessons in leadership, morale, and the art of defense under siege. It was proof that discipline and faith in one's comrades could overcome even the most desperate odds. The story of Bastogne, like that of Thermopylae or Rorke's Drift, transcended the battlefield. Today, the forests of the Ardennes are quiet again. Moss covers the foxholes where the paratroopers once stood, and the shattered tanks lie rusting under the pines. But every December, the people of Bastogne light candles and march through the snow to honor the men who fought there. Veterans, their numbers dwindling, once joined them, standing silently in the cold, remembering those who never came home. In the end, Bastogne was not merely a victory of arms. It was a victory of spirit, of endurance over despair, of conviction over surrender. And it all began with a single defiant word that echoed through the frozen woods of 1944, a word that still captures the American fighting heart better than any speech or salute ever could.